I'm Mari Carmen Valdivieso, founder and CEO of Nexos Comunitarios. Thank you for joining us today for our second NC talk, Governing the Sustainable Development Goals, Closing the Gap Between Policy and Reality. It is my pleasure to present our speaker, Dr. Tom Pegram. Tom is an associate professor in global governance at the UCL Department of Political Science School of Public Policy and deputy director of the UCL Global Governance Institute. Prior to joining UCL, he was assistant professor in political science at Trinity College Dublin. He has held research fellowships at New York University and Harvard University Law School and completed his DPhil in political science at Newfield College, University of Oxford. Tom's research interests include world politics, global governance, global policy, and complex system dynamics, with particular expertise on the UN climate change and human rights regimes. Tom also has extensive practical experience working with policymakers and practitioners at the local and international level, and he has supported our organization since the beginning. Now I'll pass it on to Tom.
Great, thanks, Marie. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, especially to be here in these strange times as we're possibly entering into another lockdown in London. So good to have company. And thanks to everyone for supporting Nexos's important work. I think more vital now than ever, really. So I do have a PowerPoint. Should I share my screen? Yes, let's see. Hopefully this is going to work. So let's share screen. Okay, yep. How's that? Okay, it's up? Yep, great. All right, so am I speaking for about 40 minutes? Was that right, Marie? Something like that?
That's perfect,
yep.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, so aim for that. Don't want to overstay my welcome. All right, so here we go. All right, so really one of the best things about my role at UCL, as Marie said, I'm an associate professor in global governance. I also help run our Global Governance Institute, is that I do get to collaborate with a lot of colleagues, with practitioners, working on all sorts of local and global issues. And of course, you know, local is global, global is local these days. And I'm also allowed to really roam quite widely in terms of policy areas, the kind of work I do, including the development field. And there's been a lot of focus on the Sustainable Development Goals at UCL in recent years. I think where we come in is we engage colleagues in health and in engineering and in other kind of vertical policy areas with the politics. So we come to them and we try and develop what might be viable policy models for delivering development, delivering policy in multi-level governance systems. Now, of course, much of the action occurs at the domestic level, domestic politics. And in that sense, it's always good to anchor these quite abstract topics, global governance, in something real. And for that, I'm grateful for my early work on Peru. My particular expertise now is on climate governance. This is quite a new area for me, but I've spent many years working on human rights, and in particular the role of ombudsman institutions. And indeed, the most fun I had doing my master's and PhD was spending many months living in Peru, embedded in the Defensoría del Pueblo, which is the human rights ombudsman in Peru, and really soaking in the politics, the people, the reality of Peru. But actually the story does begin a little earlier than that. And just here's a picture from the vault. Here I am in 2003 on a freezing cold morning with villagers in Kunkane. And you might also recognize Mari Carmen there in the bottom left in her first visit to the community. And certainly working in Peru with Marie and colleagues was a formative experience in my life and a very big reality check for a middle-class Brit from the suburbs, and one which certainly continues to inform my work and outlook to this day. So what are we doing today? Well, in the simplest terms, we're going to be trying to get a sense of how do we understand the difference between bad and good governance? How might we move from bad to good governance when it comes to development policy? And what might research be able to tell us about what works in terms of policy delivery? And a big part of the answer, which I'll stress today, lies with strong institutions, which is a quality that Peru sadly lacks. So I'm going to begin by identifying the governance dimensions in Agenda 2030, the SDG agenda. We'll define our terms a little bit. What do we mean by good governance? I'm going to focus principally at the domestic level, but within a global context. And we'll survey a little bit as to how good governance, good institution building can be encouraged in countries such as Peru. And I'll finish with some reflections on concrete policy initiatives, which might shed some light on how we move forward as a community. But first, how does this relate to global governance? So to put it simply, Spaceship Earth is in a bit of trouble. There are quite serious global threats, obviously COVID-19, but there are more threats, more risks that we're going to confront, probably more serious than COVID-19, including climate disasters, refugee displacement, financial crises. And these kinds of risks do endanger the whole global community, and compounding this danger, governments so far are struggling to deal with these kinds of risks. Indeed, they cannot really solve them alone, given that they are global. And they also appear to be unwilling to invest in the kind of cooperation that is really required to ensure resilience as we move into this century. So in that respect, for example, the SDGs are running a funding gap of $3 trillion US. That may sound like a lot of money, but the combined wealth of over 2,000 billionaires worldwide amounts to over $9.1 trillion and has risen by almost 30% during the pandemic. Now, from my perspective, that is a pretty suboptimal allocation of resources at the global level. And it does beg the question, why are governments not engaged in distribution, more effective allocation of resources? And it's quite late in the day. So global governance through the UN or some variants of, the global government, which is a bit of a taboo term, whatever variants or whatever form that might take. And of course, global governance is not without problems. WTO, IMF, this is a political program. It does require accountability. It does require checks and balances. But I would wager that some form of global governance will be and is an ethical imperative for us this century. In an age of global interdependency, where catastrophic failure anywhere could mean failure everywhere. And this is quite a novel domain of risk, and it's one that I'm very interested in right now in my current research. So how do the SDGs fit into this? Well, the SDGs really are perhaps the most ambitious effort yet to devise a truly global public goods program. It is very ambitious. It ranges across a whole series of goals. Inside those goals, there are a total of 169 different targets. Many, many governments have signed up to them at the highest levels, given that they were negotiated at the UN among top-level government officials. But importantly, the SDGs also expose vexing political challenges. The kinds of problems we face may be global, but of course, politics has not yet scaled to the global level. So we're solving global problems within a system which is constrained by national state interests. And a lot of the action occurring at the national level is independent of what happens at the international level. So the question the SDGs really raise for us is, how can we actually harness authorities, so not just governments, but also social movements, civil society, powerful private actors as well, to ensure good governance all the way down to the very local village level in terms of delivery. And in some respects, we don't really know how to do that well. We're still learning. You know, a lot of the theories are still within kind of a Max Weber 19th century Germanic command and control frame. The idea the government kind of sets these goals, it then compels its bureaucrats to implement those goals, and that might work under certain conditions, but I'm sure we're all very familiar with where those sorts of assumptions break down. So in that sense, success here is ultimately determined not by treaties signed in New York, but rather in the ability and the willingness of underlying political actors to deliver. And of course, I think we need to discuss at the outset COVID-19. So achieving the SDGs in Peru by 2030 was already looking pretty wobbly. And you can see here the Sdg Dashboard, very interesting resource actually, an awful lot of information here and data points. And this is the reality, like the snapshot pre-COVID. Green indicates that SDGs are on track to be delivered, through to red, which indicates that they're way off track. And as we can see here, this is a very mixed picture. Now, of course, we don't have good data yet as to the impact of COVID, but we know that the lockdown has already had a devastating impact in Peru, especially on the most vulnerable. And it's estimated that the pandemic is going to push at least 1 million households into extreme poverty in Peru, and it will set Peru's fight against poverty back a decade. I mean, Bill Gates came out a few weeks ago saying that the COVID has basically set back the development agenda by 25 years. Now, this is not going to be a presentation about the impact of COVID-19. As I say, it's too early, frankly, to say, but I would suggest that a focus on governance is more salient now than ever. And we've seen very major disparities in the protection of life and well-being across countries in recent months. My own country has a really shocking record in terms of per capita death rates, the United Kingdom, and Peru, sadly, also at this time has the worst per capita death rate in the world. So in this respect, the pandemic is magnifying both good and bad government in terms of the ability of government to safeguard the security of its populations. And when we put that into a longer view global context, thinking about climate destabilization, obviously this matters a great deal. And sadly, government dysfunctions in Peru is nothing new, as you all know, and the COVID-19 aftermath is going to place even more pressure on a critically stressed political system, but it might also open up windows for positive change. And obviously that's the hope here. So it's no surprise then that the SDGs place particular importance on governance as a goal in itself and as a cross-cutting priority in its 169 targets. And the inclusion of goal 16 is a real innovation on the Millennium Development Goals and an important enabler, if you will, for all the other goals here. So this is the goal broadly set out. Obviously, this is a negotiated text, so keep that in mind. This is what governments agree to. And we have here a selection of the targets that fall under goal 16. You can get more detail on the Sdg Dashboard. Now, this is an important achievement. However, it's really vital that that governance is not siloed to goal 16 and that governments are pursuing a strategy where they are actually investing in transparency, in accountability, in inclusiveness across all of these different policy programs, education, health, whatever it may be. And it's also noticeable that the targets are in practice a mixture of governance as process and implementation as much as policy outcomes. So in a sense, a distinction between obligations of outcome and obligations of conduct. And that might help try and hold governments to account to keep them honest. It might help. So governance and effective delivery structures are crucial to implementation of the SDGs, but they also pose some really serious dilemmas for policymakers, for the recipients of these global policy programs. I mean, first, there's the risk of a retreat into silos. So you have different kinds of targets, goals, which may or may not actually be compatible with others. So, for example, there's a goal which promotes sustainable growth, but others would argue that the growth paradigm is actually highly problematic, given the issues we have around biodiversity, environmental degradation, and so on. So thinking through how these different goals actually interact and possible conflicts across goals is really a very challenging, tricky, but crucial part of the SDG program. Another issue might be an over-ambitious governance agenda. If you look into all the targets that underlie the goals, there are many, many different targets. You could argue that maybe it would have been good to prioritize certain policy, certain development goals over others, and really direct firepower at those priority issues, as opposed to having so many targets under different goals. As I've mentioned, achieving delivery is going to hinge on mitigating possible negative interactions across different policy goals, and these become particularly acute within domestic settings, and certainly taking into account the wishes of local communities. That again is something which governments aren't always very effective at doing, as we've seen in the case of social conflict in Peru, not observing the ILO 169 guidelines on informed consultation and so on. And in terms of tensions between goals, another example is between ensuring that people have adequate access to safe and nutritious food, while also phasing out all forms of agricultural support subsidies. Some of these goals appear to not necessarily have been fully thought through. Perhaps most crucially for our purposes, governance tensions are going to play out above and below national institutions. So governments negotiate these texts, but of course, implementation ultimately depends on local state bureaucrats, local public officials who had nothing to do with the negotiations in New York and may have their own ideas as to how they're going to use these public funds. And we should not underestimate the potential for powerful local forces, including big business, to subvert the best of intentions. It's also a question of capacity. A lot of this depends upon local state bureaucrats who may be overworked, underpaid, or may not even exist in many parts of the country. So the goals are going to require very tailored interventions. They're going to require different kinds of policy instruments, maybe tax, maybe regulation, maybe information campaigns, education. But most of all, they're going to require really in-depth knowledge and engagement with local actors who understand what's going on within the local political ecosystem. And perhaps most importantly, it's vital that they don't lose sight of the intended beneficiaries. And the SDG process, in terms of the negotiation of the text, was not as accessible as it might have been to the constituents who are meant to benefit from this massive program. On the other hand, the importance of reaching those individuals is symbolized in the focus on poverty as goal number 1 in the SDGs. And we don't always appreciate, particularly say sitting here in London, that global governance is actually experienced most directly by people in the global south, in the global east, although this might be changing at the moment. Those who are on the receiving end of UN projects around Lake Titicaca. You're not in London, you're not in Washington, you're sitting in the hills around Yanacocha, and you're contending with the local politics of global mineral supply chains. So there is a bit of a chasm there sometimes between the way policy is negotiated and implemented. Now, this is a big challenge, implementation of the SDGs. It's a lot to contend with. And I would suggest that in many ways, a good point of departure is indeed to focus on the question of good governance. So what is good governance? How do we get there? So this is an example there of where a policy perhaps doesn't quite fit the needs of the intended beneficiaries. So good governance. These scholars provide a useful definition of governance as far as it goes. As we can see, there's no reason why this definition couldn't apply to a global political apparatus or indeed to a local, provincial, regional body. I would just flag, just to preview what we're going to do in just a minute in terms of looking through some interesting data, that this definition does not assume any straightforward relationship between democracy and global governance, and good governance, sorry. And we should be careful about conflating the two. Actually, research evidence suggests that the relationship between democracy and good governance is not established fact. There's quite a lot of contention there. Now, it's true that more countries than ever are now considered to be democratic. Formally speaking, they hold elections and so on, with more people than ever living in democracies. But the effect of democracy on human well-being is so far not that impressive. So just to run through some data points, just to make that case in very broad terms, worth exploring further if you're interested. So here we see that high democratic scores appear to have little or no bearing on healthy life years, as calculated by the World Health Organization. But evidence does suggest that the correlation between control of corruption, drawing on World Bank data, and healthy life years is quite impressive. And we see similar outcomes across other indicators. So levels of democracy appear to have little effect on the UN Human Development Index outcomes. The HDI is an index that combines life expectancy, education, and per capita income indicators. But again, control of corruption does correlate closely with higher HDI scores. Life expectancy versus quality of governance, also appears to have an important effect on health outcomes. So we can see contrasting life expectancy at birth according to levels of democracy. And then control of corruption. And again, the contrast is really quite striking. So we're going to dig in a little bit more into what these kinds of data points might tell us in terms of how we move towards good governance. But first, let's just have a look at Peru then. So it's important to acknowledge that there has been some progress in recent years on key development goals. And if we return to the pre-COVID-19 SDG dashboard for Peru, we see some green arrows. However, on the majority of these targets, there are very significant challenges. Many commentators do note a significant decline in poverty in recent years. And if you read into the scholarship on this, what we find is that there was indeed a period of unusually rapid economic growth through the early to late 2000s, combined with the modernization of some of the state poverty programs. And this is identified as the key driver running these rates of poverty decline. So Peru is on track to meet its target on extreme poverty, which is defined as living on under $1.90 a day. But it is not on track for poverty defined as a percentage of the population living on less than $3.20 a day. So when we dig a bit deeper, sort of look under the bonnet at some of these goals and targets, we see a very mixed bag of results. And of course, this kind of statistical exercise at this national sort of scale, based on different kinds of data points, not just government data, but nevertheless very aggregate, does hide an awful lot of variation as well. So if we combine poverty and we look at, say, SDG goal 10 on inequality, here we see major challenges. It's in the red. That means that Peru's definitely way off target in terms of inequality. The long-term objective being 27.5 on the Gini index. So if on the Gini index, 0 would be perfect equality. So say Denmark is in the teens, and 100 would be perfect inequality, which would be basically one person owns all the wealth in a country. So Peru was at 48.8 in 2017, and it's basically been stuck around 50 for a very long time. So that's interesting, right? So we have had a fall in poverty. Inequality has remained really quite static. And when we combine that with, say, the issue around good governance, we might explore a hypothesis to suggest that successive governments in Peru have failed to address inequality through redistributive economic policies, and the reduction in poverty has mainly been driven by economic growth as opposed to assertive government intervention. And when it comes to goal 16 of the SDGs and the importance of strong institutions, Peru is really sliding sideways or down the slope. So in particular, we see that Peru's corruption perception index score is in the red. Admittedly, it is a bit of a crowded field in Latin America and elsewhere. And we see here a heat map from Transparency International showing that Peru lies somewhere in the middle of this league table of the good, the bad, and the ugly in Latin America. So we have high perceptions of corruption, and this is bad news for the SDGs. It's also bad news for democracy. So as you can see in this table, Peru lies close to the bottom in terms of citizen satisfaction with democracy. Just 10% of Peruvians report themselves satisfied with the domestic political system. And perhaps more disturbingly, only 28% agree that democracy is preferable to other forms of government. There's some interesting variation here, right? I mean, look at Venezuela. You have very low satisfaction, but very high preference for democratic government. So interesting contrasts to perhaps mull over. But yeah, so on Peru, major challenges here. So how do we even begin to think about getting to good governance? Now, as this scholar points out, Abner Grief, we actually know surprisingly little about what makes for effective institution building, particularly in developing countries. Now, there have been some major scholarship in this area. So people like Asemeglu and Robinson, you might have heard of, who argue that inclusive institutions coupled with the rule of law are vital ingredients. So the more participative the institutions, the stronger the rule of law, the more likely you are to have robust institutions. But this emphasis on kind of the good society, if you will, does it provide us with a roadmap to get us there? And the problem perhaps with saying that we need an independent judiciary or inclusive institutions is that it's a bit like saying that in order not to have corruption, you should not have it in the first place. It's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of problem. And obviously Peru does not display conditions that are conducive to high quality governance. So how do we turn bad to good governance? Well, here's some kind of operational effort to think that through by the International Monetary Fund. I think at this point, it's important to emphasize that democratic practices are important. But democratic practices beyond just voting at the ballot box every 5 years, and we're going, or 4 years, or whatever it may be, and we'll return to that point in just a minute. So democracy matters. However, evidence indicates that an overwhelming part of human misery in today's world is caused by low quality governance. And we shouldn't assume that more democracy necessarily works as a cure against corruption. Depends a lot on what we mean by more democracy. Conversely, tackling corruption may actually be one of the most direct routes to strengthening democracy. And that may explain also why it's often vigorously opposed by those actors who would most stand to lose from effective anti-corruption efforts. So it appears then that one important foundation for good governance are strong institutions that are willing and able to check the abuse of power, to challenge corrupt practices, and to foster inclusivity. And in Peru, those kinds of institutions are few and far between. I did work, as I mentioned, on the Defensoría del Pueblo, very interesting institution through the 90s under the authoritarian dictatorship and post-democracy, and indeed something of an island of functionality within the state apparatus. But as I say, an island of functionality, and ideally we would see those sorts of qualities diffusing throughout the state. So obviously this should have implications for research. It should have implications for thinking about SDG delivery. And in thinking about governance, it's also important not to lose sight of ethics. So if we go to the IMF, the World Bank, many of these kinds of organizations are quite allergic to the language of human rights. I'd much rather speak about accountability, participation, and so on. But we need to be clear that governance is not just a technocratic exercise. Governance as implementation implies an ethical objective or outcome, and that is to serve democratic and ultimately human rights objectives. So good governance as efficiency or accountability must be coupled to an ethical understanding for how the state should treat its citizens. And of course, in Peru, we could make the case that Peru as a country has very little historical experience of truly representative democracy. And I think we have to take that kind of historical legacy into consideration when thinking about how do we actually advance good governance within that kind of context. And for this reason, scholars such as Bo Rothstein emphasize the output side of the political system. When we look at metrics that measure quality of democracy, often they're focused very much on the input side, elections, The output side is often undervalued, and it's here that perhaps we see the real normative or ethical mechanics come into play. And the output side can be cleanly understood as a distinction between access to and the exercise of political power. So if the ability to vote or political equality is vital to access on the input side, then it's the idea of impartiality which should be the core measure of good governance on the output side. So for Bo Rothstein, impartiality implies capacity, authority, but also universality. And as my PhD supervisor said to me when he read my thesis on the Defensoría, he said, oh, the Defensoría is kind of like the last bastion of universality. And I was like, yeah, that's a very interesting way of putting it, because anyone can turn up to that office. They don't have to pay to be received. They'll be listened to. But of course, the Defensoría cannot make binding decisions. So it can't close the circle in terms of policy implementation. it relies upon a functional judiciary and a functional state apparatus and a responsive government to also fulfill their function. So the principle here is impartiality, which I think is it's a nice principle actually to think about. I think it has a lot of salience in terms of how we relate to government as citizens. And the logic is that we can arrange procedures that are fair, that we can then increase the probability of just outcomes. And ultimately, we can raise social capital, we can raise trust in public institutions. But of course, this is a long-term process. It requires investment, probably over various cycles, political cycles. And that, again, is often very problematic in Latin America, where governments come and go with such frequency. On the other hand, that is obviously an important check against despots. So this brings us back to the question of, well, what works? How can aid agencies, how can civil society, how can grassroots activists, how might they be able to mobilize and push for more effective institution building in an SDG context? As I've already mentioned, governance, again, has often been divorced from politics. And I think it's very important to bring politics back to the center of the frame and explain development outcomes. It's not that you can just design perfect policies and then set them into motion and you get the results you desired. There's a lot of negotiation required, a lot of steps that separate those processes. And there's probably a lot of other actors that need to be involved, trade unions, NGOs, whatever they may be, to mediate and negotiate that policy, and also to hold local state bureaucrats and corporations to account. So anyone who's really serious about development policy needs to engage in some political analysis and probably needs some expertise in anthropology. That would be very helpful as a skill set. And we don't really have many anthropologists in the IMF, I would suggest, or indeed in many political science departments. So in the remaining time, I'll just set out a few concrete steps as to what research suggests can be done to deliver on Goal 16. So corruption seems to be really a crucial issue, and it often has not received much attention in development policy. Beyond, say, beyond focusing on safeguarding aid disbursement, procurement contracts, but corruption as a strategic policy program has often been treated as extremely sensitive. And perhaps that needs to be revisited. On the other hand, anti-corruption campaigns often focus on the input side of good governance. So access to power, elections, transparency, so on. They focus much less on the output side. So who exercises power? Who is making decisions? So efforts to address those kinds of output side policies. So that's the input side. So output side, this is quite obviously state-centric here in its framing, but we get some sense of what this might entail, focusing in this area. So this certainly is not to underestimate the importance of empowering civil society activities. But I think it's interesting to note that during the early 2000s, during the democratic spring that Peru experienced, there was a lot of rotation between civil society actors and state apparatuses. So there were people going into the state from civil society and vice versa. Very interesting kind of exchange there. And I think in many ways that was positive. I think we've also seen examples where perhaps that kind of relationship has moved into possible collusion or areas where it becomes less accountable and so on. But research does suggest that building up the capacity of control agencies within the state, anti-corruption bodies, ombudsman, and so on, is an important way to improve scrutiny of state activities. And I think civil society does have a very important part to play in holding those kinds of actors to account. As I've mentioned, political analysis is crucial in thinking about implementation at the local level, and this is going to involve local actors that can fit policy to context. But there are also a number of indirect policy avenues which research suggests can enhance institution building and anti-corruption. They're listed here. And ultimately, the goal of many of these initiatives is ambitious. They are long-term. They're efforts to embed good governance within perhaps unstable political structures. If you can embed good governance into the state apparatus as an ethos, as a code of practice, it's more likely that it will survive the end of a government, rotations of government, and so on, which is particularly important in presidential regimes, it seems. And ultimately, focusing on education, which in many ways is the key to unlocking an awful lot of the SDGs, education should also be in the business of transforming the relationship between government, the state, and the citizen. You know, an informed citizenry is the best check on corrupt practices. It's the best guarantee of good governance and high quality democracy. And all of these policies are backed up by evidence in the scholarship. And I've put a few references at the end of the slides in case anyone's interested to explore that further. So to wrap up, this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some ideas as to how we might move from bad to good SDG governance in a context such as Peru. And institutions are a big part of the answer. I'm not going to say they're the whole answer, and perhaps there'll be questions we can explore in terms of more structural, systemic, radical, transformative policies that might be pursued. But nevertheless, evidence does indicate that control of corruption and those kinds of policies are correlated with good governance outcomes. But policy interventions will require engaging directly with power. And a lot of neoliberal technocrats are very nervous about actually addressing power, how power is distributed in society, and of course the economic structural conditions which enable or obstruct public interest regulation. And when it comes to Peru, post-COVID, it's very likely that exports are going to take off again. There is major demand, particularly in China and other countries. But of course, big social problems are going to remain. And placing attention on the output side of how power is exercised by public officials in practice, I would suggest policies along these lines are urgently needed in a COVID, post-COVID context. And these involve not only checking the abuse of power in Peru, but also, and perhaps unfashionably, given the strong neoliberal orientation, investing in state capacity, in public administration, and ensuring that the state infrastructure is deployed in the service of human well-being. I mean, ultimately, the legitimacy of the state will depend upon its ability to meet the demands of the citizenry. There's obviously a lot of complexity hiding in that statement, which we could get into. But I think the key point here, when it comes to the SDGs Agenda 2030, is that many steps do separate policy and implementation on the ground. And COVID-19 has made that job much more difficult, it's undeniable, but that is the task in front of us as a global community, and it's a worthwhile one to pursue. So that's my presentation, hopefully more or less on time. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I don't
No,
know if
unshare.
I don't know if anyone has any questions. You can raise your hand, or I think I'm mute. I can start with one.
Does anyone know how to unshare the screen, or is that a? Sorry, I don't know how to do that.
Hold on.
Okay, it's okay. I guess I can just, if that's okay, I'll just go back to that.
Yeah, that's okay. I would like to start with the questions. First, you were saying that good governance is political. So do you believe that poverty is a political choice as well?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, essentially I would say that ultimately, poverty is not inevitable. It's not ordained by some higher power. Poverty is a outcome of the way we have chosen to structure society. It is an outcome of decisions that are made by certain powerful executive actors. How we deal with poverty is obviously highly complex. I think it's important to flag that when we're thinking about governance, there are very few countries which have really satisfactorily dealt with poverty, which poses an interesting question as to why poverty is such a wicked problem to solve. But on the other hand, we live in a world where 8 million people still die of starvation each year. So we haven't actually been able to solve that. And many people would argue that this is a result of politics, not a result of, a lack of food supply. So I think it's always important to inquire into how decisions are made and to sort of to trace your way back from an outcome back to, say, the decision-making forum. And when it comes to poverty, again, it is highly complex, because ultimately it raises questions around responsibility, and it raises questions as to well, why is it that some societies seem to have made that a priority concern while others have not? And the kinds of social forces that are in play in unpacking that question, well, as I say, it is very complex, but I think the answer to your question is quite a simple one.
Oh, yes. I have another question, like if no one is ready yet. I've been reading lately about the concept of degrowth, and well, I like it, but I just find it I don't know if it's attractive to many people, and but I do believe, like in our work, no much is going to happen if we don't start working, or like more like as a community. But we all have priorities these days. We're all suffering from COVID, and I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to think, or to ask you, what do you think about the growth and their connection, or if there's any connection with the SDGs? I would love to hear that from you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I'm thinking about a lot myself in some other work I'm doing on climate change. Now, when I mentioned at the end that institutions are part of the solution, but there may be bigger systemic forces at play that we need to look at, well, your question really speaks to that systemic level. Organizational reform, institutional reform, corruption reform, all very valuable within this paradigm, within the current sort of structures and, well, the status quo, the system as we understand it. But it may be that it's not sufficient. we can't know, and that's perhaps part of the reason why we're so paralyzed when it comes to responding to climate change in a decisive fashion. Climate change obviously is deeply integrated into the SDGs. In many ways, the SDGs rely entirely on dealing with climate change. You know, you can look at various targets and say, well, these are improving, you know, neonatal care, child mortality, and that's really important. But of course, if some other factors such as water security are worsening, food security, ecosystem degradation, if they're rapidly deteriorating, well, that's really bad, because ultimately the things that we care about that are getting better depend upon that environmental substrate. Everything depends on our ability to navigate the climate situation. And when it comes to thinking about policy responses to climate change, degrowth really touches a nerve, because ultimately it's a whole system response. It's a response which is a radical transformation of the system, which is, it tackles it's not looking at the output end of the problem, emissions, right? Emissions of carbon, that's what is pumped out of the chimney. It's looking at the input side of the problem, which is rampant consumerism, rampant extraction of natural resources. So degrowth is very interesting in that sense, and in some respects, it's a simple solution to understand. Some argue that if we were to prioritize degrowth, that would solve many of the very complex problems that climate change raises. But how we get there is itself an incredibly complex puzzle, because we're all in the matrix, right? To use an analogy from the Matrix, it's very hard to step outside the system and look back in. There's no view from nowhere. And we're all complicit in climate change as well. We're all consuming. We can't really help it. And one of the challenges with, say, decarbonization, which is another policy you hear a lot about, and decarbonization ultimately is still mitigation policy. It's not really thinking about psychology. It's not thinking about changing behavior. Degrowth is a response to those limitations, and it also seeks to be a critical voice by highlighting the fact that often decarbonization measures are a recipe for commodification of nature. And many critical people argue that's not going to be good enough either. You can't put a dollar sign on whales, you know, that's just ultimately that's not going to fix this problem. So I think degrowth is really fascinating. It's not in the Paris Agreement. It's not in the Sendai framework. It's not in the Sustainable Development Goals. There's no way that the negotiators would have let it into the text, but it's certainly currency among, well, scientists, people who are seriously looking at the problem and are sort of in objective reality and thinking about, well, what kind of solutions are really going to cut it.
Thank you. Now Marielle has a question. And then Robert.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for that really interesting presentation, Tom. I have a question that kind of goes back to Mari's first one. So her question, whether poverty is a politics, and you answered that basically, yes, it is. And going back to I think it was your last slide that said that one of the things that needs to happen is that the people need to restart making demands of their governors, of their governments. And so my question to you is basically, how do you think that can look? Because we're in a moment where COVID has put us in front of all the things that need to change in our world. It's a moment to start rethinking about doing things better. And so when you consider that there's an increased militarization across the board, across the world, that is sent out to quash any demands, any protests, any manifestations that goes against the established governments, how can we start rethinking the ways people can make demands so that politics regarding poverty start changing?
Well, that's easy. No, I'm kidding. It's not easy at all. Yeah, good question. I mean, it's a very challenging question. And obviously, we're all following the news closely, what's happening in the US, but of course, it's not just in the US. Well, democracy is rolling back in many different countries, and civil society, particularly human rights defenders, particularly environmental human rights defenders, are under unprecedented attack now. So this is a very challenging context. There's different ways of approaching it, I suppose. You could argue that one reason why these kind of protest movements are receiving so much pressure is because they are being quite successful. There seems to be almost a sort of a contestation over narrative at the moment, you know. So in the UK, for example, we heard a couple of weeks ago that the government wants to remove any reference to anti-capitalism in schools. So all reference to Marxism or anything to do with anti-capital thought to be removed from the syllabus. I think that's very interesting. I mean, it's almost like there's this contestation over who is going to control the frame, who's going to control the narrative. And maybe that's a battle which actors who are media tech savvy and are organized can engage in quite seriously. And I would, you know, perhaps take some optimism from Noam Chomsky, who isn't known for his optimism, but if when, you know, put on the spot with this question, he argues that given the information ecosystem, it's going to be incredibly challenging for authoritarian actors to shut society down. And we have to hope that's the case. I mean, obviously we can't know how history is going to roll out, and it's very unlikely that anything we said about 2025 would look anything like the reality in 2025. So these are tumultuous, exciting, troubling times. But I would take some heart from, say, what Greta Thunberg has achieved. I find her message to be quite powerful, direct. It does seem to have cut through. She's media savvy. She seems to be good at organizing. And ultimately, I think a lot is going to depend on that generation. I mean, I'm sort of the sandwich generation, you know, I've just turned 40, so I can see it from both ends, I guess. And obviously my students are all in their early 20s, so these are conversations we have quite often. But it's really going to be up to that generation to engage in a major effort to restore the integrity of our political systems and ultimately restore the integrity of our ecosystem and biosphere. I mean, it's a big ask. It's an awful lot of responsibility to ask of them. And perhaps that's the greatest challenge, is how do we encourage young people and, well, everyone else, of course, but how do we encourage people who have a real stake in the future to step into that responsibility? And that obviously goes beyond perhaps my political training, but I think it's a crucial question. I mean, just a final thought on this. I do obviously run human rights seminars, and we do a lot of work on mobilization and protest, social protest theory. And, you know, I could give you a stock answer about how we do this. You know, we put pressure on governments, and we like a Joe Biden government will be more responsive than the Trump administration, and that's correct. So put pressure on the elites to set the agenda. We engage in strategic litigation. You see that a lot in climate change. You know, you go to the courts, hold them to account through the rule of law where you can, and of course you hit the streets and you try and mobilize public opinion. But I think ultimately there are some blind spots there, and we don't know really exactly how to do this. It's not like the human rights movement has really mobilize the kind of critical mass that we saw in the heyday of the trade union movements, you know, and that's what we need. We need that kind of critical mass, some kind of organizational structure, some kind of normative frame, as well as social purpose, an understanding of shared pragmatic concern that can get people out, to get people, to make people feel that they have a stake and an interest in being involved in this, what could be a very exciting project for this generation. But that, I think, is a key issue, is how do we actually create a frame, a narrative around collective social purpose? And it's got to have a socioeconomic component as well. It's got to address economic injustice. I think you're muted, Marie. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Tom, thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Roberto. I have a question. Basically, following on one of your last slides where you mentioned sort of next steps or recommendations, one of the items that you touched on was tax reform, and I totally agree with the need to do so in multiple jurisdictions, particularly in a COVID context where a lot of people are obviously unemployed. One of the things that interests me about tax reform is, particularly in the Latin American context, is how many countries in Latin America struggle to capture how can I put this? A lot of countries in Latin America actually struggle in essentially raising the taxes that they're entitled to. Like their tax capture rates are pretty low. And so when you look at a COVID context as well, a lot of the focus has been on a tax reform, but I haven't heard that much in terms of expanding the ability of governments to capture taxes that they're already entitled to, particularly from wealthy groups that are pretty good at sheltering some of their money overseas or to accounting mechanisms. And so I wanted to bring that up and see if you had any thoughts on that, or any if you could reference any sort of discussions that are happening in academic circles around those items of taxation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm obviously not a tax specialist, so I'm a bit of a layman here, but I do have some thoughts on this. And in Peru, obviously, taxation is a major sort of policy concern. It's a perennial problem in terms of, as you say, in terms of tax collection, it already is a very regressive tax system, but the government doesn't even receive what it's due. And then, of course, within the context of socio-environmental conflict, the issue around the tax owed by mining corporations, often transnational mining corporations, and so on. We're all very familiar with some of those dynamics. Now, I think in terms of framing a response to this, or at least posing an interesting frame to start thinking about it, it would probably be to emphasize the global context within which the Peruvian taxation system operates, which I think is what you were alluding to, because ultimately a lot of these tax evasion operations or tax avoidance, which in the UK is not illegal, but essentially the same thing, tax loopholes, these are negotiated at very high levels behind closed doors by various different kinds of actors, including corporate actors, including international corporate actors. And there's a lot of pressure placed on governments to relent and to ensure that tax policy remains favorable to private interests. And I'm obviously not entirely au fait as to how that goes down. You can read lots of anecdotal evidence of how, say, aid restructuring programs in the 80s, adjustment programs led by the World Bank, often also very much promoted by major Western governments, led to a lot of pressure to deregulate, to detax, and so on. Have we seen much reversal of those trends? I'm not sure. Are we in a post-Washington consensus? Perhaps. I haven't seen the research. What is the role of, say, these new rising powers, maybe risen power, China? I'm not quite sure how they engage in those kinds of transnational negotiations. But ultimately, it seems it's very challenging for any individual government to actually devise an effective, robust response to those kinds of pressures alone. And this is, you know, we're very inclined to see the world in terms of nation states. It's very hard for us to perhaps expand our imagination to think of what policy could look like if we were to redesign political structures. So I'm just going to roll that out as a thought experiment. But if we were thinking about how we were really going to tackle this, it's probably got to be at the global level, right? So Thomas Piketty's work, he's said that essentially we need a global, we need effective global governance on tax. We need effective regulation on tax havens. Tax havens should not exist. Tax havens, if you read, say, Pankaj Mishra's work, an excellent essay in the London Review of Books recently, tax havens, as far as he's concerned, and he's a critical post-colonial scholar, also he's a brilliant writer of non-fiction. He basically argues that tax havens are an extension of colonial policy. It's the same extractive logic that's been in operation for hundreds of years, and it's no coincidence that the major havens for tax evasion are the engine rooms of colonialism. You know, London and other major capitals, and of course British protectorates all around the world, the Cayman Islands, and so on. And there have been major efforts to try and engage in global regulation. They haven't come to fruition. There's obviously huge resistance, and it's an open question whether it can be done. I would say, though, that the European Union, as kind of a prototypical global governance, which is not, say, an empire model of global governance, right? If you think of global governance as empire, you think of the US, you might think of China, Belt and Road Initiative. And again, I'm just speculating. I wouldn't necessarily say that is the case. But the European Union offers a very different kind of prototypical example of global governance. And in that space, we do see efforts to regulate big corporations, to tax big corporations at a supranational level. So I think there's some very interesting innovation there. And there's some speculation that the reason why we're Brexiting from Europe is exactly for that reason, that major private interests based in London do not want to be subject to future EU regulation on tax. And I think that's about as plausible as an explanation as any I've heard to explain Brexit. I still don't understand, frankly, what's going on. But thankfully, I've got my German passport in my back pocket. So as I say, these are very broad frames, but I think thinking globally is helpful. I think it might be vital when it comes to tax. It's certainly vital when it comes to climate change. And we also think about COVID-19, you know, lockdowns and vaccines. These are national policies. They reinforce nation state sovereignty and privilege. But a real response to COVID-19 would be a global response, because until we've got it sorted out in Bangladesh, we're not going to be safe in Berlin or London. But unfortunately, the way our political apparatus is structured currently, we don't think in global terms. So it's just not even in discussion. So yeah, there's a bit of a big picture response there for you.
Anyone else? No? Maybe if I can ask for a last reflection, because at the beginning of your presentation, you talk about how global is local, local is global. How can we promote this? Sometimes it's challenging to promote the idea to support communities that live in poverty. So we would appreciate a last reflection from your point of view.
Okay. How can you support thinking globally, acting locally? Go vegan. check where your clothes are made. Check your slavery footprint. And I mean, I speak very much as a Westerner, where I think the onus is on us really to check these things out. So there are things that we can do at an individual level, but ultimately that's not going to solve this problem at scale. But I think the think globally, act locally is, you hear it everywhere, and it's a lovely idea. It's a phrase which I'm a little bit suspicious of now, because you hear it also by actors who clearly are not living by that motto. And but I mean, on a more subtle level, I think it's really interesting just to lean into and understand that actually almost all of us are doing the exact opposite. Most of the time we're thinking locally and acting globally. And I mean by this that we are often complicit in externalizing all sorts of harms by our actions and completely unaware of it. And that's why I opened this up with, slightly tongue-in-cheek, go vegan, check where your clothes are made. But there's a serious point there, that in some respects the problem that we face is that the harms that we're complicit in are very indirect. They're very difficult to observe. They are hidden within supply chains. They're hidden from view. But when you spend £600 on an iPhone, you should understand that, well, there's probably some slave labor in that iPhone. So are you willing to spend £2,000 on that iPhone, and then they can be made in Sweden, with the very best, or they can be made under Swedish labor regulations in Bangladesh or wherever it may be. So I think it's a case of just beginning to wake up to the fact that we are entangled in this context where it's almost impossible to think globally and act locally, although we should really try. And I think data and internet and just being informed, that's a really important step in that direction. And I don't buy just secondhand clothes, and I'm not living like a saint, but I am awake to that reality, and I think that's something which is worth encouraging. And then beyond that, it's going to require concerted political action by the Greta Thunbergs of this world and so on, to ensure that we can make informed choices. But it's also, of course, going to be a case that we need to ensure people aren't living in poverty at the end of those supply chains. Because ultimately, a lot of the response you'll get is, well, that's all very well and good for you to say, but these people need jobs, and better that they have jobs at the end of a supply chain in China or wherever it may be than not. So within the current sort of economic logic, you end up getting quite entangled in all sorts of very contested debate and terrain. So it's going to require a lot of clear thinking and a lot of, I think, just being open to new possibilities.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for this great presentation. It has been amazing. And thank you for all of that you have joined us today. And we hope to see you next month. We will be sharing on social media and on email about the next Nexos Comunitarios. Have a lovely afternoon, evening for everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.